Hello, and welcome to Hopeful Conversations, brought to you by Robbie's Hope Foundation. I am your host, Kari Eckert. Joining me today is Allison Mallory. She's a mental performance consultant and a case manager at Colorado University in the Psychological Health and Performance Department. Thank you, Alli, for joining me today, and to our listeners, welcome to Hopeful Conversations. So, what can you tell me about being a mental performance consultant? What does that entail?
Well, it is definitely a fun job. So I work with our student athletes here at CU and work either individually or through like team workshops to help support our student athletes' mental health, as well as like developing mental skills training to help them like on the field or court or track or whatever sport they're in. So I do both the clinical side, so working with a lot of anxiety, depression, suicidal ideation, relationships. Those are some big ones, as well as like on the other end, like lack of confidence, maybe some motivation stuff, how to set goals for themselves, things like that. So I like to do both, and that's kind of a big part of my role.
Are you finding that college athletes, do they advocate for this type of training on their own, or do they wait for like a crisis to come to like your office?
So I've been here 3 years or over 3 years, and I would say within the last few years, but then also talking with people who had been here longer than that, there's been a really big shift in educating like all the athletes. Okay, so mental health is a continuum. It doesn't mean that you need to be on this end of the continuum to then come in and use our services. So really trying to push like preventative work, which I think the mental skills training actually does a really good job with that. So a lot of like, mental skills training is coping skills and how to regulate emotions or manage pre-performance anxiety. And so the more that we can do more of that mental performance work, I think that actually has been really helpful in preventing, the crises or, significant mental health concerns overall. And that's our goal as well. But, I think we do a really good job of getting in front of teams every year, trying to be really present at, practices or games or the fueling station, and continuing to push like, hey, don't wait until you're in a crisis. Like you can come in like before for different things. And so I think also the more that they know us and are familiar with us, then the less likely they are to hold off until it's a crisis.
So more of a proactive approach.
Definitely, yes.
And it sounds like you're doing some like relationship building. So you're like valid to these athletes. Like they see you, you're not just this office that they have to go to if something's wrong.
Exactly. Yeah, that's like a huge goal for our department, is like trying to be as present as possible. And, I have to credit our athletic director, who has done a great job in allowing us to hire so many people. So, the more clinicians that we have in our office, then the less likely we have to always be in sessions all the time. But then instead we can go and do outreach programming. We can be at Boulder Buffs. We can be at all the practices, the games, things like that. So then we aren't just these strangers that...
So just like a physical therapist on the sideline, you get to be there as well.
Yeah, so it definitely depends on the team, but we've actually, especially with football, since Coach Prime's gotten here, they have, like, we travel for every game. We're on the sidelines for every game, home or away. They have really done a great job of, pushing for us to be part of like the medical team. So
as you should be. It's right. Mental health it's physical health. It's not just this other thing.
Right, exactly. So we're definitely trending in the right direction, which is really cool.
Do you still get some resistance, like from some coaches, if you will, like that are more just like strictly performance on the field or court or whatever venue it is?
Definitely. I mean, I think, it's definitely never going to be perfect. I think I've seen a lot of improvement over the 3 years that, I've been here, just with, different people really focusing on building relationships with coaches. I think that's like very, very important, because also if they don't know us or if they aren't familiar with how we can support, then of course they're not going to, schedule out times for workshops or let us be a part of practices or games because they don't know us. So I think it's also a two-way street of making sure that we're trying to build that relationship so that they can see how we can support their athletes.
What is the best way that an athlete can support themselves? Like, let alone if they're a D1 athlete or maybe a high school athlete. I mean, like, so many young people are involved in sports and it's such a big part of their lives.
Yeah. I mean, I would say, like, the best way they can support themselves is to acknowledge and accept what's coming up for them. So I think a lot of times athletes have this mentality of like mental toughness or just push through, everything's fine. And a big thing we try to educate our athletes here is that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to, talk about your mental health struggles and normalize that we all have mental health. It's just that continuum I was talking about earlier. So I think, just the more people can be like honest with what's coming up for them, and then, reach out, whether that's to us, whether that's to a teammate or a coach, because we also do a lot of education for our athletes as well as our coaches, our support staff, on what to do in crises like that. I think just being honest about what's going on and try to seek help.
It's okay to not be okay is very much our language as well. Why is that such a human thing that's just hard to accept? Like,
I know I think it's hard. Like you see, social media, I would say, has a big impact on that. You see people's highlight reels and not necessarily their normal day-to-day life. And so if you are just looking and it looks like everybody else is okay, then sometimes it makes it hard to admit that you're not and you're actually are struggling. But then the opposite of like the more people that are honest that they're struggling, then I think that'll just continue to impact other people to be honest and normalize like their own struggles.
I like vulnerability. Like as soon as you turn that switch and you're vulnerable with a person, like your relationship just goes to a different level, like immediately.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And I think that comes to like creating also like psychologically safe like environments. So like doing, again, the education with like coaches or athletic trainers, nutritionists on how to create those type of environments. So then, athletes feel comfortable, being vulnerable, because that's also not like the easiest thing to do, but it's so, so impactful.
How do you define a psychologically safe environment?
Yeah, so psychologically safe would be like, an environment where trust is at the forefront. And so like really focusing on building relationships with your athletes. I think coaches showing vulnerability themselves is really important. So not just putting on this like power dynamic, like don't talk about feelings kind of thing. So I think the more that the coaches can show how to be vulnerable, how to be human, I think that's a big thing. Then that trust can be built, and from there, then someone could feel like they could be vulnerable with the people around them.
I'm hearing trust a couple times, and I'm just kind of wondering, like, it's almost like not a natural behavior for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think at this age, with college students and even high school students, I think it definitely depends. I would say like trust can be harder for some people more than others. I think if you've ever been, burned by someone in the past who maybe broke your trust, then that can be hard to then start to trust people moving forward. And just, depending on someone's childhood or how they were brought up, it definitely can impact how they approach situations or how they work with other people. So, but I think, if you have that trust, if you are able to be vulnerable with, your support people, I think we talk about that a lot of like creating like your support system here at CU. And the more that you can have those support people, then, you'll be vulnerable with them, you'll feel that trust. And from there, I think it'll be really helpful for someone's mental health.
when you're coaching an athlete, like what presents the most? Is it anxiety, like performance, or what's the number one thing that you see as potentially an issue for an individual?
Yes. So we track all that data. And actually it's interesting. So like on CU's campus, it's a little different. So the top 3 presenting concerns, it's depression's number 1, then anxiety, then relationships. But then for athletes, what we see is anxiety's number 1, then depression, then relationships, which makes a lot of sense given the amount of pressure a student athlete's under, social media pressure, coach pressure, internal pressure, family pressure. So it makes a lot of sense that we see anxiety as number 1. But definitely the top 3 is anxiety, depression, and relationships.
So what's a skill that you can teach someone, an athlete, about anxiety?
Oh, there's lots of different skills. I think the first part is recognizing how the anxiety shows up for them. So like I always have them kind of describe like the physical symptoms of anxiety, but then and also just having them describe like what it looks like for them, because that can be like ruminating thoughts. It can be like increased heart rate, sweating, shaking, panic attacks. So having them kind of describe it, and then from there implementing coping skills to like fix the problem or whatever. So like for instance, if they feel anxiety in their chest or in their stomach and it's like a pit or whatever, then really trying to implement like belly breathing or square breathing, or, you know, maybe it's like incorporating your senses, like trying to do like some grounding work. Or if it's somebody who's struggling with like overthinking, then it's, you know, there's different techniques that could help somebody either like unhook from unhelpful thoughts or reframe unhelpful thoughts, replace unhelpful thoughts. You know, just a lot of the times I always say like, I want you to have as many tools in your toolbox. So, you know, a lot of times a mental skill will work for somebody and not the other person. So it's a lot of figuring out what works best for each individual.
The unhook one is a new one to me. I'm not, as a person who kind of struggles sometimes with sleep, and I think that's, you know, a pretty typical thing for all age groups and all types of people to deal with, the unhook. Like, how do you unhook from an anxious thought?
Yeah, so that comes from acceptance commitment therapy, or ACT, and there's different like techniques to unhook from thoughts, but the basis of it all is that you don't feel like you can control your thoughts necessarily. Like you can't change them. You don't have that ability, but you can control your relationship with the thoughts instead. So it's like visualizing, you know, an unhelpful, like you have them identify an unhelpful thought and you watch it like float down a stream, or you have them like rearrange it on a screen, or turn down the volume on the thought, but you're never trying to like change or stop the thought. You're essentially just trying to give it less power. Yeah. So I actually always give this example. It's like an ESPN metaphor that works really well with athletes. So I always say, like, if we're in our this therapy room, I'm like, okay, just stick with me for a second. But let's say
I'm with you.
Yeah. There's a TV in the corner and it's playing ESPN. And, you know, the ticker at the bottom of ESPN, just the constant like news updates just passing by. That's how I view our thoughts, in the sense that like we can be fully present in this room while those thoughts are just scrolling by on the TV. And you're not trying to turn the TV off. You're not trying to like run out of the room, or like you're not like fully up against the TV, like staring at those thoughts. You can still be fully present and still have an enjoyable experience while those thoughts are scrolling by on the TV. And so that usually works pretty well with athletes, just to be like, oh yeah, like that makes sense. And
it is a good visual. Yeah.
And you know, I didn't make that up. I definitely learned that from a supervisor. But then from there, it's like normalizing. That's not an easy skill, but it is something you can learn through, like, you know, and that's where the techniques come into play. So maybe that's visualizing it floating down the stream, or you can like label thoughts. So it's like, I notice I'm having the thought that I suck at volleyball instead of like I suck at volleyball. So it's just trying to create some like distance from those thoughts.
Oh, just even labeling that the I have a thought.
Yeah, I notice
Adding
I'm
that.
having the thought that.
Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting. Why is our brain so misunderstood? Like, why do we?
I don't know. I mean, it's crazy how, I think it just depends like, throughout the years of, theoretical orientations too. There's been so many different waves of like how our mind works, and ACT is actually like the third wave. So it's like the newest one, which is why I like to use it a lot, because I think it works really well for athletes too, because it kind of puts like less pressure on changing the thought, because sometimes it is hard to like change a thought that's really powerful or really impacting them. So trying to just kind of like give up control and be like, you know what, thought's going to be here, and how can I still perform, or how can I still interact with my teammates even when the thought's still present. And
There's a lot of pressure as a college athlete. Goodness. I'm going to make a little bit of a transition, because today we came to this conversation because of Boulder Buffs, which I think is a really cool program that CU has. Explain Boulder Buffs to our listeners.
Yeah, so Boulder Buffs started, oh my gosh, way before I started working here. Erin Rubin King used to work at CU, and she was the old leader for it. But it originally started a group of athletes, approached PHP, which is our department, and really wanted a space to just normalize and destigmatize mental health for athletes. So it was very much student athlete led. And I think there was probably around like 20 people at the time. And they would just talk about ways like, how can we normalize mental health on our teams? How can we work to destigmatize? What's programming we could implement? And so that's how it started. And then COVID hit and
things changed.
Yeah, things changed. Shocker. And I think it kind of, not dismantled, like it was still happening, but it just looked really different. And then I started working here around that time. And from there, we tried to figure out different ways of like, okay, should we have like a Boulder Buffs leader to like run it? Should it be more like led by PHP? And so throughout the last few years, we've kind of gone back and forth on trying to figure out what works best. But at the end of the day, it's always been about like education around like we always start each semester with the 3 R's. So
yeah, the 3 R's. I have them written down. Recognize, respond, refer.
Yes.
Can we break those down?
Yeah, for sure. So first part is being able to recognize like how someone could be struggling. So really trying to educate our athletes on like just common behavior changes that may be occurring. So obviously it all comes down to like knowing your teammates, because if you don't know what they're normally like, then you wouldn't be able to even notice like a behavior change. But
know their baseline.
Yes, know their baseline, exactly. And maybe that's like increased in substance use. Maybe it's they're starting to isolate. Maybe they're, starting to act in like riskier behavior, things like that. And then also like just like statements that could be concerning. So like, I just don't want to be here anymore, or, even making jokes around like suicide or something like that. So being able to first recognize the signs, and then how do you respond in those moments? So like coming from a place of like, I want to support you, like how can I best support you right now, rather than like, you need to go to PHP, something's not right with you, so really trying to come from a place of like, I love you, I want to support you, like how can I do that right now? And then from there, making sure our athletes know how to refer. So like if especially in like noticing like if the athlete of concern is saying things that are very concerning of like, I don't want to be here anymore. And they ask like, well, what do you mean by that? And they're like, I just, want to give up. Or, if they're starting to really make those concerning comments.
Some strong language, yeah.
Yes. And we always emphasize, like, we don't want you to become their therapist. That is not your job.
It's not your responsibility.
Right. Like, because that's way too much responsibility for a college student.
Anyone.
Anyone.
Even an adult. Yeah.
So then from there, it's talking like, all right, how can you get them to PHP? How can you, depending on the situation. So we have here at CU a 24/7, it's called Buffs Helpline. It's protocol, which is a phone line that a lot of college campuses use.
Oh, I would sure imagine most colleges' campuses have something like this.
Yes. And so we call ours the Buffs Helpline, but essentially, 24/7 support. It's a licensed clinician on the other line. And so that's definitely used after hours. So making sure they have that phone number saved in their phones and like explaining that, even if the athlete of concern doesn't want to be the one to call, you can call for them and just sit there with them. So like there's those options. Obviously, if it's during office hours, like having them walk them to our office because we're in athletics. So just walking them upstairs or whatever.
These athletes are spending a lot of time there anyways. They know where your office is. Yeah.
We're literally right by the study hall. So it's pretty easy to find us. But then, of course, the extreme of like calling 911 if you do feel like they're an imminent threat to themselves. So so that's the last R of referring, and just making sure that they, we go through scenarios, we answer a lot of questions, and honestly, the athletes are always very much like bought in. They want to learn. They are like asking very good questions, and it usually ends up going really well.
They become pretty comfortable with it pretty quickly.
Oh yeah. I mean, I really feel like this generation like does talk a lot about mental health, and obviously athletes have their own, stigmatization, but at the end of the day, like I think a lot of them are very passionate about destigmatizing mental health. Yeah. So it is really cool to be working with this population because they know it. Like I think a lot of times they're more like, can you talk to our coaches? Because we get this, but maybe the coaches still don't, and that kind of stuff.
And those are good skills, those 3 R's that recognize, respond, refer. Like they're going to transfer to any stage of their life. Like whether it's when they're in the working world and with a coworker, like, hey, I recognize this about your behavior or the emotions that you're expressing. Like, and I'm going to respond like this. I'm not going to be the one to fix you, but let's get you some help. Like help is available. Exactly. Or like this is what the kind of education that I bring to parents. Like it's not your responsibility or to fix, but it is as a friend or someone who cares, a teammate, it is your responsibility to get that person to someone else who can help them.
Absolutely. Yes. I think the big emphasis of like, it's not your job to fix, because I think that's sometimes keeps people from even doing anything because they don't know what to do. Yeah. So then they don't even want to like ask the question or, say anything because they don't know how to fix. And, so for us to be like, don't worry, you don't have to fix them. Like it's literally just showing them that they have somebody that, cares about them and wants to help. And then like how to then direct them to the people who can help and support.
It's a big responsibility when somebody trusts you with their feelings. And that very sadly, after Robbie passed away, we had like the schools put on like a vigil, if you will, and he had just finished tennis, so it was supposed to just be his tennis team, but there was a lot more than just tennis players there, and from other schools as well, swimmers, and sadly that evening we learned that during Robbie's freshman year of high school that 2 other kids came to him with their suicidal ideation, and that was really very, very difficult to hear at that moment. And I have reflected on that many, many times in the last 6 years. Like now I work in this field every single day, and I have a degree in psychology, and I am educated. And if someone came to me saying that they wanted to hurt themselves, I would immediately get that person to a professional. Like I don't care what my relationship is with that person. If they trusted me, But for like a 14-year-old or a 20-year-old that's trying to go and play football, that's
Right.
too much.
Yeah. No, it is. And to not be prepared with, if that could happen, then what to do, that just makes it even harder. So I think for us, just trying to prepare our athletes, like if this ever does happen, here's what you could do.
Yeah.
I think that can always be really helpful because, it's hard to hear in general, right? Like even for, someone who works with it every day, like it's still not easy to hear that somebody's having those thoughts. I think I just have become, very destigmatized.
You're not desensitized to it. No, it's still.
It's like, it's the normal now. But it's not, especially for someone who's never talked to somebody who's having those thoughts. It's definitely not fun.
I saw on the Boulder Buffs website as well, destigmatizing, and that's truly part of our mission. Like, how do young people destigmatize that we all have mental health, and the mental health isn't like a person who asks for help isn't weak? What are some?
Yeah, so we've done a few things that have all come out of Boulder Buffs. So we have mental health awareness games where we literally have warm-up t-shirts that say mental health is health, or oh gosh, now I'm blanking on some of
You're on the spot. It's a little bit harder. Yeah.
But we've come up with ways just to normalize mental health, even just through a soccer game or a volleyball game, or so we've done things like that. We talk a lot about on your team, what can you do as just an individual to normalize or destigmatize mental health? So maybe that's checking in with your teammates and just being how's everyone's mental health doing? Or, hey, I was really struggling yesterday with some anxiety. Has that ever happened to you? And I think the people who do attend Boulder Buffs are already those people doing it, but I think they're also learning or looking to learn ways of continuing it or doing even more because they know it's such a big issue and just important matter.
And you have peer advocates in this club, correct? Students?
Yep. Yeah. So it's all we try to get people from every team. We also partner with SAC, which is our student athlete leadership committee. And so they have somebody a leader from every single team on their committee, and they have a Boulder Buffs liaison. So they'll also through SAC talk about ways to support Boulder Buffs, help with different events. And so we have a lot of support, but we have ideally people from most, if not every team that can then, even just update us on hey, how is the overall mental health vibe on your team? How can PHP support? What are some things you all can do as leaders on your team? Things like that.
Buy in and they feel like their time is making a difference.
Oh yeah, definitely.
What kind of advice would you give someone that's, maybe on the cusp of having that opportunity to be a D1 athlete or continuing on past their high school career?
Some advice. I would say try to, usually for athletes, something we see a lot is their athletic identity is kind of their whole identity. And that can end up being harmful down the road. And so trying to find balance in your life, obviously being an athlete is a huge part of your identity. And I never want to minimize that or anything like that, but also finding other hobbies or things you love or different parts of yourself that you love. So maybe that's I'm also a really great friend or a great son or daughter, or I enjoy painting, find those other things as well, because at the end of the day, an injury can happen, or you don't make the team, or it's harder than you think. Yeah. And so it's you want to have other parts of your identity to fall back on in case there are any setbacks, because that's just also part of it. So that would be
That's good advice really for anyone. We get so hyper focused on what we're doing at that moment, whether it be a young parent or just a plain college student, like majoring in this, or I'm a nurse, like, in your whole identity, and our identity like can be multifaceted.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, we do that a lot here.
That's tough, but really good advice. Oh goodness. I'm thinking I've just recently read about Travis Hunter and I was like, wow, like he has winning the Heisman Trophy, which is super exciting, but like sounds like a very disciplined individual.
Yeah, no, he definitely is. You can tell he's very passionate about football, but also just mastering what he does.
I mean, some balance, like that, like I mean, here's probably like he has more in his life than just football as well.
Yeah, he's a great example. Like, I think he said it multiple times on camera of like, what do you love doing? It's like, oh, I love fishing. Like he has all these different hobbies, these different people in his life that he loves. And, it's obviously he loves football, but he also is a great student and he has other things outside of football to keep him balanced, which I think has definitely helped him along the way.
Like it is going to come, like sports do come to an end for most individuals.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, at some point for everybody. So, yeah, it's definitely important to have different parts of your life that you love as well.
I wonder why the burnout happens so much for high school athletes. Do you have any?
Yeah, I mean, I think burnout can definitely happen when you are just, solely doing either one sport or it's just become your whole life. And from there, like, lack of motivation is just bound to happen, right? So it's like, even being able to recognize like, okay, well, why am I playing this sport? Or what am I willing to sacrifice? And what am I not willing to sacrifice? And really setting those boundaries like early on in your high school career could be really helpful so that you don't burn out. But then, yeah, also like playing other sports or, joining some clubs or
having other interests. Yeah.
Having other interests. It's so, so, so important because.
But like a 15-year-old often isn't a part of those decisions. Like it's
Right.
not even on their radar to like advocate like, hey, I'm doing this way too much. I like it. I don't know that I like want it to be everything that I love.
Yeah, which is so hard. And I think obviously there's like a parent component as well of, maybe it kind of needs to come from them, but that means they also need to recognize what burnout could look like and how to like prevent it. And then of course you add in like NIL these days, and that's just like a whole other situation of adding more pressure, maybe even from parents or on this the student athlete of like, oh, I need to make it to the next level so that I can support my family or provide for the people I love. And so it's definitely changing the landscape of college athletics and high school athletics.
At the level that you're working with athletes, are parents pretty much out of the picture? Is it pretty much just the student athlete?
I would say it depends. Like you definitely still have athletes who are sending money back home to, provide for their family. Or have athletes where they didn't, leave home that, like, homes down the road. So, parents still have an impact, but definitely you also see, athletes being by themselves for the first times and making their own decisions and having to manage adulthood. And, that comes with its own implications and struggles. So it's, I love working with this population because college can just be really hard. And so having someone there to help like provide like support or resources is, I think, is just a fun time for us to be a part of their lives.
I bet it's super interesting, exciting and challenging, and you just see so many different things.
Yeah, definitely.
What's the favorite part of like what you get to do?
That's a hard question. I honestly love my job. Like I feel like just getting to know all of the athletes. Like I love that I don't just work with one team. I can work with any team or any student athlete from any team, or with like team workshops. I work with most teams, which is really nice. So I think just getting to know the student athletes on a like human level and not just like see them as athletes, I think is probably my favorite part for sure.
Humans are pretty cool.
Yeah, they are. And I'm biased, but I feel like our athletes are awesome.
Oh, I'm sure. What else do you want to share with our listeners before we kind of wrap this up? Maybe about PHP, the Psychological Health and Performance Department, about advocating, getting help for yourself just for a young adult?
Yeah, no, I mean, I can definitely touch on our department just because I think it's really cool and unique, like how PHP is, set up compared to other college athletic departments. So we're fully embedded within athletics. Our office, like I said, is literally right next to the study halls for athletes. And we have, oh my gosh, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So 6 full-time staff members, and then we have 2 part-time staff members. So and then we all have like our different specialties or backgrounds. So I feel like we do a really good job of getting in front of student athletes, supporting them, being a great resource. And I just think, you compare it to other athletic departments where there's like 1 or 2 sports psychologists for like 600 athletes. And I can't imagine.
The numbers aren't there. Yeah. To do a good job.
Yeah. So it's really cool to see. And I think obviously CU athletics puts a lot of emphasis on supporting mental health. We have this thing called whole student athlete development, which is like essentially the department that oversees our department, and they look at like every part of an athlete. So it's like they have us, they have the athletic trainers, the nutritionists, the academic, like every part of an athlete's life they oversee and then emphasize like how to then support us, because they just see that it's so important to not just focus on like an athlete's physical health, but all the different components of it.
It's exciting to see what campuses are doing, and it's just like the shift in emphasis and priority. I read that CU has a chief wellness officer for the campus. So I hope that they continue to make strides for all athletes, because the work that you do with student athletes certainly trickles into, just the general population of CU, which trickles into the adults that are going to be trickling out into the next stage. Like, it's all good work.
Oh, absolutely. I agree.
Well, this has been a really cool conversation. But before I let you go, Alli, I have one question.
Okay.
That question is, what does the world need to hear right now?
Oh, man. What does the world need to hear right now? Go easy on yourself, I would say. Because I think we can be our biggest critics, and with all the things going on in the world right now, I think, just if you can be, a support person for yourself and, be kind to yourself, then I think that'll make everything a little bit easier.
So go easy on yourself. I like that. Put your own oxygen mask on first, is what I always like to say. Like, you can't help somebody else if you aren't taking care of yourself.
Yep, exactly.
Well, thank you, Alli, for being my guest today. And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on A Hopeful Conversation. Be sure to tune into our next episode. And until then, remember, hold on. Pain ends. Thanks, Alli.
Thank you.